A billionaire catches a homeless boy dancing with his paralyzed daughter. A ragged, hungry boy named Max slipped through the gates of a sprawling estate and found Juliet sitting in a heavy, cold silence. Her eyes were empty, fixed on a world she could no longer reach. Then, Max did something no one expected. He began to dance. Not for coins and not for bread, but simply to steal a smile from a girl who had forgotten how to breathe. What happened in those few minutes would shatter their world and rebuild it forever. Henderson was one of the most powerful men in the hemisphere. From the glass towers of London to the shipping ports of China, his word was law, earning him the nickname, the Golden Touch. Everything he touched turned to gold. Yet behind the limestone walls of his manor, his greatest failure was the silence of his only child. Juliet, once a vibrant 15-year-old, had been left paralyzed by the same accident that took her mother's life. Once, her laughter was the heartbeat of the home. Now, the halls only echoed with the sound of Henderson's regret. Before we move forward, kindly click the subscribe button. Before Max ever set foot behind the limestone walls of the Henderson estate, his world was defined by the relentless rhythm of the city's bus park. His name was Max, or at least that was the name he gave when the drivers shouted at him to move. He had no parents anyone had ever seen, no siblings to share his scraps, and no bed other than the hard, unforgiving concrete of unfinished buildings or the space beneath the bridge. His clothes were a map of his struggle. A shirt torn at the shoulder and shorts that hung loosely on a frame far too thin for a growing boy. Yet, Max possessed a secret weapon against the misery of his existence. His joy. When the sun beat down and his stomach rumbled with a hunger so sharp it felt heavy, he did not beg with a bowed head. Instead, he danced. He performed for strangers at traffic lights, twisting his body into ridiculous shapes and swinging his arms like a circus clown to drown out the noise of his own suffering. Dancing was his shield. It made the hunger feel lighter and ensured he didn't feel invisible in a world that preferred to look away. On this hot afternoon, as he wandered past the billionaire's mansion, he wasn't looking for a miracle. He simply saw a girl through the gate whose sadness mirrored the cold nights he had survived, and he knew that for her, he had to move. Max wandered past the towering gates of the Henderson estate, his feet calloused from the sun-scorched pavement. Through a small gap in the manicured hedge, he spotted Juliet sitting motionless in her wheelchair, her small face resting heavily against the armrest. Her eyes were fixed sadly on the ground, clouded by a silence that seemed to swallow the entire garden. A sudden spark of empathy ignited within Max. He knew the weight of that darkness and felt a desperate urge to chase it away. Without a word, he squeezed through the narrow opening, stepping onto the lush, private lawn like an uninvited ghost. He began his performance immediately, pulling exaggerated, silly faces and twisting his thin frame into ridiculous, jerky movements. His arms swung like a clumsy clown's, and he spun with a wild, unrestrained energy that made him look utterly absurd. At first, Juliet simply blinked in shock, but as Max caught himself in a dramatic, pretend stumble, a tiny giggle escaped her lips. Then the miracle happened. Juliet erupted into pure, unrestrained laughter that echoed across the silent compound. In that moment, Max forgot his own hunger and his lack of a home. He wasn't a beggar anymore. He was a child bringing life back to another child, his heart racing with a victory far greater than any coin he had ever earned. Inside the mansion, Henderson froze when he heard a sound that had been absent from his home for months. Juliet's laughter. He rushed to the balcony. his first instinct being one of cold, protective anger when he saw a ragged, barefoot boy in his garden. His fists clenched as he prepared to call the guards and have the intruder removed immediately. But as he stepped forward to intervene, the sight before him stopped him in his tracks. Juliet was no longer the slouched, hollow figure he had watched in despair for months. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, her back was held straight, and her eyes were alive with a spark no expensive specialist had been able to ignite. Henderson realized that while he had spent millions chasing a cure, this street boy had brought his daughter back to life in less than 10 minutes. When he finally stepped into the garden to confront Max, the boy froze, prepared for the adult anger he usually faced on the streets. However, Juliet's plea to not send him away softened Henderson's heart. Looking at Max's steady eyes and scarred knees, Henderson felt a tightening in his chest that wasn't anger, but hope. He chose to let the boy stay, realizing that Max had given Juliet something money never could. What began as a single afternoon of laughter soon transformed into a daily ritual that redefined the mansion's atmosphere. Henderson gave strict instructions to the guards. At exactly 4 o'clock, Max was to be allowed through the gates. The garden, once a place of silent mourning, became Max's stage, and Juliet was his only, yet most devoted, audience. Max arrived each day with new routines, acting out the chaotic quarrels of bus conductors or mimicking the dramatic sirens of the city streets. Every exaggerated fall and ridiculous spin was a calculated move to keep Juliet's attention locked on the possibility of joy. Slowly, this unconventional entertainment evolved into a secret form of therapy. Juliet began to do more than just watch. She began to participate. She would lift her arms to mimic Max's robot dance, and her hands grew stronger from the constant, rhythmic clapping. Max taught her, through his wild movements, that his own body felt heavy with hunger until he decided to make it light through dance. He showed her that movement started as a spark in the mind before it ever reached the limbs. Watching from the shadows, Henderson noticed the subtle shift. The way Juliet's toes would twitch in anticipation and the new, confident resonance in her voice. Max wasn't just a performer. He was a bridge back to her own body, proving that hope was the most effective medicine in the world. The garden was bathed in the amber glow of the late afternoon sun when the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Max was mid-performance, his energy more electric than ever, as he attempted a complex, slow-motion spinning move he had dubbed the helicopter. He pivoted on his bare toes, his arms outstretched like wings, defying the gravity of his own exhaustion. Juliet watched from her chair, her eyes wide and her fingers gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. For weeks, Max had told her that the body follows where the heart dares to go, and in this moment, Juliet's heart was already spinning alongside him. As Max reached the peak of his rotation, he paused, holding a hand out toward her as if inviting her onto the stage of the living. Without thinking, fueled by a sudden, violent surge of willpower, Juliet leaned forward. Her breath hitched as she placed her weight on her feet that had felt like leaden anchors for a year. Henderson, watching from the terrace, dropped his glass. It shattered on the stone, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of blood in Juliet's ears. Slowly, agonizingly, she pushed. Her knees trembled, her muscles screamed in protest, but then it happened. For 3 shimmering, impossible seconds, Juliet stood upright, her shadow stretching long and proud across the grass. She was no longer a spectator of life. She was part of its dance. Though she eventually sank back into the cushions, the silence of the mansion was gone forever, replaced by the realization that a miracle had just taken its first step. The sanctuary of the garden was soon breached by the cold reality of the outside world. News of the ragged intruder had leaked, spreading through the elite circles of the city like a wildfire. Rumors twisted the truth, suggesting that Henderson had lost his mind or, worse, was endangering his daughter by allowing a common street beggar into the inner sanctum of their estate. At the weekly board meeting, the air was thick with judgment. Henderson's business partners, men who valued polished shoes and ironclad reputations above all else, sat in grim silence until the eldest among them finally spoke. They warned him that his association with Max was a stain on the firm's prestige. They spoke of brand integrity and social standing, cautioning Henderson that a billionaire's home was no place for a child of the gutters. One partner even suggested that Max was a security risk, a clever thief who had charmed his way into a fortune. Henderson listened as they reduced the boy who had saved his daughter's soul to a mere reputation risk. For a moment, the old Henderson, the man who lived for the approval of the markets, felt the sting of their words. But then he remembered the sight of Juliet standing on her own 2 feet, her face illuminated by a joy no board member could ever understand. He realized that the only real scandal was the hollow life he had lived before the barefoot boy danced through his gates. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the manicured lawn as Henderson found Max sitting alone on the cold marble of the back steps. The boy was staring at his own feet, his toes wiggling in the grass as if he were trying to memorize the sensation of softness before it was taken away. The laughter from the garden had faded into a pensive evening stillness, and for the first time, the billionaire saw not a miracle worker or a scandal, but a tired, hungry child who had spent his life fighting a war against the world. Henderson sat down beside him, ignoring the dust that clung to his expensive tailored trousers. He looked at Max's profile, the sharp jawline of a boy forced to grow up too fast and the messy hair that had never known a mother's brush. Softly, Henderson reached out and placed a hand on the boy's small shoulder. He told Max that while he had been trying to save Juliet, he had actually saved them both. He promised Max that the days of dancing for scraps at traffic lights were over. From this night forward, there would be no more concrete pillows or rain-soaked nights under the bridge. Henderson's voice was thick with a new kind of authority, not of a tycoon, but of a protector, as he told the boy that he finally had a home, a name, and a father who would never let him go. The transition from the wheelchair to the world was not a sudden leap, but a series of trembling, courageous moments shared between 2 children who had both known what it was to be trapped. Within weeks, the mansion's polished hallways became a training ground. Max, now wearing clean clothes but still preferring to go barefoot to feel the floor beneath him, would stand a few paces ahead of Juliet, his hands held out like a safety net. He didn't use the clinical language of the therapists. He spoke of the rhythm of the earth and the strength of the spirit. He made every agonizing inch feel like a victory in a grand game. One bright morning, as the sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Juliet pushed herself up with a newfound stability. She reached out and grasped Max's calloused hand, her small fingers locking onto his with a grip that said she was never letting go. With a shaky breath, she lifted one foot and placed it forward, then the other. It wasn't the perfect stride of the girl she had been before the accident, but it was the walk of a survivor. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at the boy who had danced her back to life. "I'm doing it, Max," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm walking because of you, my brother." Max beamed, a look of pure, unalloyed pride crossing his face that no amount of gold could ever buy, as he led her toward the garden they both now called home. Years later, the mansion was no longer a monument to solitary power, but a living, breathing home filled with the sounds of a family rebuilt. Henderson stood on the terrace, watching the sun paint the horizon in shades of crimson and gold, mirroring the warmth that had finally settled in his chest. In the distance, Juliet was walking through the garden, her stride confident and free, with Max by her side. They were laughing at a shared secret, their bond as inseparable as the earth and the sky. The billionaire looked down at his hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts and moved markets, and realized they had never felt truly full until they had reached out to pull a street boy from the shadows. A profound realization washed over him, humbling his spirit. For decades, he had believed that his golden touch made him the most successful man in the city, but he finally understood that his life had been a hollow museum of expensive things. He had been a man of immense treasure but zero wealth. It wasn't the surgeries or the private jets that had saved his daughter. It was the barefoot remedy of a boy who had nothing but a dance. Henderson whispered a silent prayer of gratitude to the universe for the day Max had slipped through that hedge. He saw now that true wealth was not found in the numbers on a balance sheet, but in the courage of a child who refused to be broken, the laughter of a daughter who found her feet, and the capacity of a hardened heart to finally learn how to love. Henderson wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a father, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly rich.